Hello viewers, with me today is Colonel Terry Yan, retired of the United States Air Force. He is the Public Relations Officer for the Valiant Air Command Warbird Air Museum. And today he's going to be taking us on a tour through the museum, and I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much.
Give us a little bit of information about the group and what do you guys do.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome to the Valiant Air Command Warbird Museum. As was mentioned, we're going to take a tour. We have 3 separate display hangars and 2 separate memorabilia rooms or museums that we're going to go through today. The Valiant Air Command was formed in 1977 with a group of about 11 individuals, more or less like a club, that wanted to dedicate themselves to honoring the memory of those that flew and crewed these great vintage warbirds. Today, some 36 years later, we're relatively well known throughout the United States and even the world for a couple of things. Number one is we have an annual Warbird Air Show every year. We're getting ready to plan our 36th annual air show, which will be this year the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th of March, which will include United States Air Force Thunderbirds flying in it. We also are well known for our restoration facility. We've been restoring aircraft since 1977, and as we're going to show you today, we have several aircraft in our restoration facility undergoing that kind of maintenance to restore them both to exhibit and flying condition. And we get calls from around the United States and from around the world from other organizations and groups that are restoring similar aircraft and know that we've been in the business for some time. If you want to know more about any of these activities, I would suggest you go to our website, which is www.vacwarbirds.org. We're open 7 days a week from 9 to 5, so if I don't mention it again at the end, please come by, take a tour, and become a part of history.
Thank you very much. Let's go explore.
Alrighty.
Where are we at now, Terry?
Well, first thing is you enter the Warbird Museum, you come through to our gift shop. This is where you pay your admission, where you get a little brochure that tells you all about the museum, the history, and some of the exhibits that we're going to see. We have some 35 to 40 vintage warbirds on display here, from World War I all the way through modern jets. So if you come into the gift shop itself, you'll find lots of different items related to warbirds, whether we're talking about hats, t-shirts, clocks, models, a lot of different memorabilia. In fact, this is a destination. We have people that come here not necessarily during the holidays to go through the museum, but just to find different, interesting, unique gifts to give to that warbird enthusiast and that individual that's passionate about warbirds. Once you've paid your admission and gotten your brochure, you'll next proceed into our main memorabilia hall, which is where we're going to go now.
Alrighty.
So through this door is our main memorabilia hall. The first thing you notice when you come in is a great World War II aircraft called the Grumman Wildcat. The memorabilia in this room starts with World War I, goes around through World War II, Korea. There's also a little bit of Iraq, Afghanistan, and a few others. You notice I skipped Vietnam. That's because we have a separate hangar dedicated exclusively to the Vietnam era, and all of the aircraft that we had in our collection from the Vietnam era stored over there. So let's start over here and I'll give you an example of what we have. This first device you see here was the very first pilot simulator that we had in the military. It's called a Link trainer. It was invented by a guy by the name of Edwin Link, worked for his dad's piano factory in upstate New York. In the 1930s, he invented this trainer, but unfortunately the only people who were interested in it were carnival rides and amusement parks. Nobody thought the military needed a trainer or a simulator. What changed that was, if you'll recall, in the 20s and 30s we began to experiment with airmail service, flying. It was military pilots that did this initially. They weren't used to doing what they call blind flying, which was flying at night or in clouds. We crashed 6 aircraft in 1 month, and they decided to give Link's trainer a different look. It was an instrument trainer, and by that I meant it taught the pilot to fly without the aid of instruments, or without the visual ability to look outside. If you want to come over here and take a shot of this instrument panel here. What happened was the student would get up inside there, they would close the door and close the top so that he was completely enclosed, and all he had were those instruments that you see. And it taught the pilots how to fly on instruments only without the aid of a horizon. Into the museum, I'll point out the World War I aviator that you have up there. That's what we're going to talk about a little bit now. If you look at the World War I aviator, that was really the beginning of military aviation. Well, there had been some in the Civil War, there had been some ballooning for reconnaissance. It really was after the Wright brothers and World War I where military aviation began. If you look at his uniform, we didn't have a pilot suit or pilot uniform. They just flew in whatever outfits they had. That happens to be a cavalry soldier. And because the cavalry was pretty much out of business when World War I started with the machine gun and barbed wire, it was cavalry officers that initially made up the pilots, and they acted as cavalry in the air. We're going to go down here and take a look at one quick aircraft exhibit. This is a Newport, and it's from the 94th Pursuit Squadron. If you go up to Langley Air Force Base today to the F-22 Raptors and look at the 94th Fighter Squadron, you'll see the same design on their tails that you see here. It's the Hat in the Ring Squadron. Came from a speech by Woodrow Wilson that we're going to throw our hat in the ring. We're going to join you guys. This is the same outfit that Eddie Rickenbacker belonged to. Eddie Rickenbacker was a very famous World War I aviator. It was called the Ace of Aces because he had the most kills of any of the other aces in World War I. Lots of things we can talk about in World War I. Let's just briefly mention the machine guns. In a lot of old black and white movies, you may recall the machine guns sitting up here on top of the wing. That's because they had not perfected the art of flying and being able to shoot bullets through the propeller. It was a Frenchman by the name of Fokker who first initiated some stainless steel deflector blades on the back of the propeller. Ultimately, it was the Germans who perfected an interrupter or synchronizer that was attached to the shaft of the propeller so that when you fired bullets and the propeller came around to this location right here, you would pull the trigger. Nothing would happen for a brief second until it came off this cam and you could start firing again. And modern aerial gunnery was born when one of these devices was found by the Allies and given to the French and to the Americans and the British. As we move down, we're going to look here briefly at World War II. This is a map of the island of Oahu, and what it tries to point out is how the Japanese came in and the fact that they didn't just attack Ford Island or Battleship Row. They attacked every military organization that we had, installation that we had on the island of Oahu, and there were many of them. There was the Marines at Kaneohe, the Army was up here at Schofield Barracks, you had the Navy over here at Barbers Point, you had a lot of other Hickam Field, and they did that so that no aircraft could come up and meet them while they were able to attack the battleships. If you come around on this side, and we'll show you a little bit better display, this is a much better display that shows how the ships were arrayed. The big thing was aircraft carriers. As we got ready to go into World War II, the aircraft carrier had kind of taken over the battleship as the role of the main big gunned boat in the Navy. And it was the aircraft carriers that the Japanese were after. Fortunately for us, all of our aircraft carriers were out of Pearl Harbor. They were on the way to Wake Island. One was back on the West Coast undergoing restoration. So when the Japanese attacked, there were no aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor. There were a lot of things that they did right and a lot of things they did wrong. This is a very shallow harbor at Pearl Harbor, so all of the various vessels that they sunk, in some cases it was only 10 or 15 feet under these large capital ships, so the the battleships rather, did not sink and just were out of use forever. They sort of settled in the mud and then rolled over. We were able to recover and reuse many of these ships. As we go on down, another display I'll mention briefly is the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. Not a lot of people know that women during World War II flew every fighter and every bomber that we had in our inventory. By that I mean they were ferry pilots, is what we call them today. We had no way of moving the massive amounts of aircraft that were coming out of our factories to all the operational training bases overseas and in the United States. And in an era when women would not have been allowed, they wouldn't have been even solicited to come in, they were contracted to join, go through that link training. They went to the factories and picked up all the fighters and bombers and cargo airplanes we had and moved them to the training and operational bases all over the United States. Unfortunately, as the war began to wind down, they were rather unceremoniously released. Some of them even had to buy their own bus tickets home. They were not in the military. They had no GI Bill. They were just released. They were contracted civil servants, and it wasn't until really the 1990s that they began to get some recognition. The next device I want to point out here is called a Norden bomb sight. As you may recall, the British flew at night. The Americans flew in the daytime. We bombed the mainland of Europe in the heart of World War II 24 hours a day. This device helped us perform high altitude, pinpoint, strategic bombing, because we didn't have computers in those days, and if you want to drop an apple and hit your foot, that's pretty easy. But to drop a bomb from 20 to 30,000 feet, which is the average bombing altitude, and come anywhere close to a target on the ground, you had to take into consideration a lot of different variables: the wind speed, the direction you were going, your speed, the weight of the bombs, even the pressure and temperature. This device was an analytical device that allowed you to dial in and to calculate without a computer the various solutions that you would need on exactly where along your final approach path you need to drop the bombs. So the next place we're going to look at over here briefly is the Flying Tigers. If you walk this way, we have a display case here on Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers. Now the Flying Tigers were in existence when World War II started. Claire Chennault had been an Army Air Corps pilot. He was recruited by Chiang Kai-shek, the dictator of China. The Chinese were fighting the Japanese. They had been in Manchuria since the late 30s. They were having a lot of problems trying to form an air force. Chennault went over there. He asked for volunteers and folks in the military that would just take their rank off and join up with him. He had 99 P-40 Warhawk aircraft that they flew, and he developed tactics against the Japanese that we would go on to use throughout the war. The Japanese fighters were very light, very nimble, and very fast. These P-40s were heavy, slower, and they had armor protection. Chennault would tell his guys, do not get in a horizontal battle with the Japanese. If you fight horizontally, you'll not come home tonight, and you won't bring my aircraft back with you, because the Japanese can turn within you. If you get in a turning battle with them, they will outfly you. We're going to attack in the vertical. These P-40s would fly up as high as they could, wait for the Japanese, dive down on the Japanese. In a dive, they could reach or exceed the Japanese speed. They have lots of armament. So when the Japanese were fast and nimble because they had no armor protection for the pilots. They did not have self-sealing fuel tanks. These things had 6 machine guns on them. When they'd open up with those 650 cals, it pretty much took care of the Japanese. They had a 30-to-1 kill ratio. Had 300 kills, lost only 10 of their own to combat. 30-to-1 kill ratio. To put that in perspective, the best fighter in World War II was the Hellcat, had about a 15-to-1 kill ratio. In the Korean War, it was the F-86 Saberjet, which we're going to see shortly, 10-to-1 kill ratio. In Vietnam, we were approaching a 1-to-1 kill ratio before we reestablished Top Gun and Red Flag. So 30-to-1 was an unbelievable battle a record that'll probably never be equaled. Move on to the Tuskegee Airmen. We're very fortunate in our town here in Titusville to actually have an original Tuskegee Airman. His name is Hiram Mann. He actually flew the famous P-51 Red Tails. If you've seen the movie, you know about these folks. It was a difficult time in our history, but the folks that wanted to be patriotic and join the fight had to actually fight to get into the fight. Hiram and the folks at Tuskegee Institute went through a special class that was developed for them to be able to qualify them as not only aviation pilots but also military officers. And then they initially were stationed in what then was the backwater of the war, North Africa, because the war had already gone through that. And it wasn't until they got into Europe and became known as the famous Red Tails that you pick up the stuff that legends were made out of, how they protected the fighters and became such a force to be reckoned with as far as the folks in the European campaign were concerned. So we're going to walk on down here and just see a few other things as we pass by. You'll see a lot of memorabilia and art on the wall. I encourage you to come in and look around because there's so much to see, and we just don't have the time to talk about each and every item.